In this video, I will be covering a production pipeline of creating static props for use in game engines. I'll be showing off taking hard surface models from Maya and then organic sculpted models from Zbrush, texturing them in Substance Painter, and then finally importing them into Unreal Engine. This video will definitely not be exhaustive, as every game and project has unique problems that need to be solved, but it hopes to give you a basic understanding of the main sort of checkpoints you want to hit when creating static props for a video game. As this will be an explanation heavy video, I will also include a little section summary page after each section that you can refer to if you're going to redo this process a few times, which you will with your process until you kind of get a handle on it. Check out the chapters in the description below to skip between these summary sections easily. Now, while I can't cover every single kind of software as well as style of prop and types of prop, I will give you a basic understanding and hopefully enough context to think about the main checkpoints when creating a prop that you can apply to other areas. We'll also talk about how to be efficient with your time and resources and try to make these props as minimally intensive on our graphics so that things can all run smoothly. Let's get started by having a look at models made in software like Maya. So this is going to be more hard surface models, anything you've created using your regular modeling techniques. There will be some difference between things that are modular, things that are larger, things that are smaller and similar. But I'm going to cover the main process, which covers most of them. And then each one of these will have a few little caveats that we'll tackle along the way. First thing we should think of when we are creating any sort of prop for a game is a uniform scale. Now, usually the best way to do this is to just model in real world scale as much as possible. Every software has its own scale and it's usually just defined by some sort of imaginary unit. But if I just create a cube here and hit T, bring up my settings, anytime I see a number like this, it's referring to a unit. By default, mine is centimeters. So if I made this width here 100, technically now this little stick here is 100 centimeters or 1 meter across. Now, we can use measurements like that and kind of get things really, really correct. But for the most part, if we're just game artists, we're not engineers. So what I'd recommend for that is using something like this little guy here. So in Maya, we actually can get this for free. If you just click this little box here, the content browser in your poly modeling shelf, we just get a bunch to choose from. And it usually goes to this bipeds by default. If you scroll down, just this human body MA, you can just drag that into your scene and you get this guy who's, I think it's like 180 centimeters or something, about 2 meters. Just nice to kind of place these around your world or next to props you're creating so things are the correct scale. So if you've got weapons or tools or things they pick up or, doors they need to go through, just plonk one of these guys next to it and then you'll be able to see if things are looking relative to scale. The main thing really though is that everything you create for your game or your project is the same scale because it is 3D at the end of the day. We can always scale things up afterwards. The other thing related to modeling that we should check before we start prepping our props for export is the integrity of the mesh. So what I mean by that is we want to make sure that everything is modeled cleanly and there's no modeling errors. So what these usually present themselves with is things, if we just have a look at these cubes, double extrudes. So any edges that are like right on top of each other, be the same for vertices as well. So you can see here, if I've extruded twice, I've got twice as many edges here, which can cause some issues. Interior faces are a really big problem. They'll cause a lot of problems. So if I just go vertex face, we can see I've got a face inside my mesh. Even so everything is enclosed on the outside, this will cause a lot of dramas when I get to UV unwrapping and texturing. So definitely want to make sure you don't have any of those. And last thing is just your general topology. So best case, your topology at this point should still probably be mostly quads. So we really don't want to see anything like this, which is an n-gon, right? It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sides, whereas most of our faces should only have 4 sides. Triangles have their place and they're okay, especially for game models. Setting in our triangles is something we actually will do right before we export. But during the modeling process and when you kind of finish, you'll most likely just have nice quad geometry as long as you kept things clean during the process. You may have to remodel some stuff. If you've got anything like this, you need to fix it up. There is some tools. You can try merging vertices. There is mesh cleanup, as well as the best method is sometimes just to delete stuff and remodel it a little bit cleaner. To start preparing our game props for export out of Maya, we should probably name our models so we don't get confused, but also if you're working in any sort of group environment, studio with other people, you really want to make sure your naming conventions is something that you keep consistent throughout your whole project. Now, when you're modeling, usually you'll have weird little names like this. Like you can see my fence has a name pcube12. So we just want to make sure that this is named something appropriate. So I might want to call it modular fence. On top of this, you also might want to start tagging different things with suffixes or prefixes. So this is always going to change depending on where you're working, what you're doing, what the project is. The main thing is that everybody in the project, and if it's just yourself, you want to keep it consistent. So in Unreal, by default, if we're thinking about this as a static prop, it's a static mesh, they use a SM underscore prefix. But you can imagine you could change this up depending on the sort of project and the team's naming convention. So it might be something like even just geo for geometry, just to tag these things that we know they are models. Now, one other thing, one of our little props here that I'm going to use as a demo is a little battery here, and it has a high poly version. Now, if you're doing realistic props for games, you pretty much can't get away with not doing high poly to low poly baking. So what this requires is a low poly model that we're going to prepare UV unwrap, and then a high poly model, which just gives us all the realistic lighting and every sort of extra detail that we're going to need. So things look a lot nicer, but without taking millions of polygons into the game engine. We can showcase this really quickly by just having a quick look at some cubes in Substance Painter. So these are exactly the same, just regular cubes. You can look at the wireframe, 6 sides each. There's no detail difference at all here. The only difference is the one on the right here has a high poly version that I've baked in, and the one on the left here is just the regular low poly. And the main difference you can see is these nice edge highlights, right? So these are very realistic. Most objects are going to have some sort of tiny little bevel like this that's going to cause light to hit it and sort of shine off it, as opposed to over here where you can see we're not getting any highlights. Same material, and we just get these kind of mathematical corners which don't look so real, right? So in some styles that's okay, but if you're going for a hyper realistic, you're going to want some sort of high poly bake to get a lot nicer result like this. This one's going to be pretty simple. I'm not going to cover too much in depth about the baking process and getting this correct, but we will bring it up every time. So you'll get a basic understanding, and then at some point I'll probably do another video on that. For now, in this naming section, all we need to make sure is these are named the same, right? We need to make sure they're exactly the same. And what can be good for Substance Painter's baking is we use this suffix of underscore low for the low poly, and then underscore high here. So I could of course put, SM in front of this as well. But if I did that for the one I'm going to export, I probably want to just make sure it's the same for the high poly too. So just make sure you're keeping this the same, and then underscore low, underscore high for the respective models here. Next up, before we start UV unwrapping, is to tackle the normals of our object. Now, the reason we want to make sure these are correct is so things look how they should once we get to the game engine. But this is also a very key point in doing a high poly, low poly bake. So normals are pretty much in its most basic form just where our edges, or technically our vertices, show as a smooth edge or a hard edge. So you can see here I've got hard edges on the right, soft on the left, and we get a very different result on how the light hits this object. So what we need to do is prepare our meshes so that wherever we wanted a hard edge, there should be a hard edge. Where we want soft edges, we can have soft edges. The reason these ones exist, obviously, is because we don't want to have millions of polygons on something like a cylinder to make it look like it's round. So I've even visualized them here. You can see an averaged normal gives us the soft result because there's only one little stick there, but a hard edge gives us two here, so it splits them. And this is something that will come up later in the baking process. Why this is important is, we don't want hard objects like a cube here to look weird and soft, and we don't want round objects like a sphere here to look really hard and seeing every single polygon. Of course, this can be a stylistic choice, but for the most part, we're going to avoid this. So how do we approach this on a model like this? So we want to make sure, as mentioned, everything we want to be hard is hardened. Everything we want to be softened or averaged is softened. So the best way to start, and really the best way to do this, is as you model. But if you got to the end and you want to make sure everything's correct, how I'd approach this is grab your model, head up to mesh display where most of the settings you want here. And we've got harden edge, soften edge, and then soften harden edge. I'd usually start with a soften harden edge. So the reason for this one is this does a bit of an automatic job for you. If you click the settings box, you can see how it works. Angle is at 30 degrees. So anything that is larger than that angle, so like a 90-degree turn, it is going to be a harden edge. But anything below that, it's going to think it's a soft edge. So you kind of need to find a sweet spot. Usually this is decent enough. You can use this, but depending on your model, you might want to change it. If I click soft hard here, or just click it up there, you'll see it has changed some of mine. So obviously before mine was prepared, but if I was doing this again, I would probably do the same thing. Now you can see some of these edges that I had, they were a lower degrees on the angle, so it's softened them back out. But if I wanted these to be hard, this is where I have to manually go through. So I want to click on the edges I want to harden, go through and everything. I'm not going to go through everything here, but I then just need to go to my mesh display and then harden edge. You can also find shortcuts for this by holding Shift right click, soften harden edges, and they're in here as well, everything you need. As you can see, that's hardened my edges there, and what I would need to do is go through until I hit a point, like I had before, like this, where everything is appropriately set up. So there's no weird hard edges on my soft round shapes, and there's no weird soft edges on my hard shapes. Now we've completed our initial cleanup stage, we're ready to move on to the main section of our model preparation, which is UV unwrapping. UV unwrapping can be quite a tedious process, so we want to try to think smart about this, see how much we can get away with letting the computer do for us, but also hit the correct result we're looking for. So this is definitely where we're going to talk about the differences in models and see what we can look at for larger models, collections of models and things like modular props as well. I'm going to start by going through the process here on this little battery model, and then we'll jump over probably more near the end of the process. To get started with UVs, we first need to open up the UV editor, which in Maya is just up here, UV editor, and I've got it split on my screen here. Another super key thing to do before we start UV unwrapping is make sure we've frozen our transforms. So I can just select my object, click this little snowflake here. The reason for this is if we ended up having any scale data especially, things will get disproportionate in the UVs. So we'll have some sort of weird scale inside the UV that won't translate directly to the 3D space itself. So definitely make sure we've frozen transforms. In our UV editor, there's a few things we have to do to get started. So we can do a more manual approach, and then we can go for a more automatic approach. How you mix these is definitely up to how much time you want to save and how important the object is. I usually recommend a mixture of them, and you just need to find the balance between getting the best result you can and then not spending way too much time on a prop that might just be in the background. So to get started, we need to first do some sort of projection. We can find our projections in Create here, and we have a whole bunch to choose from. Now, if you're going for a full manual approach, I always recommend camera-based. What that'll do is just capture the shape of your object in the UV space, and it doesn't really matter what angle, but the main thing here is it doesn't have any cuts. So now you could go in there manually and add your cuts and then unfold things as you go. This is always going to give you the best result if you go full all the way through manually. But what I'd recommend is try to start with some sort of automatic projection and then go in and do some more manual unwrapping. So instead of just starting with the camera base, I'm going to grab my object again and do an automatic. I'm going to click that and it's going to do a fairly good job straight away. Now there's a few things we have to change here for sure, and there's a bit of manual unwrapping to get a better result. But as I sort of mentioned, if this is a faraway object in your background, this will probably do for the most part. What we should check at this stage is our test texture that we can turn on and off up here. And it's just a checker map. So if I click that, we just get this checker map here. The checker map on the 2D shows up like this. It's just a bunch of squares. So what we should expect if that is being applied to our 3D object is a bunch of squares on the 3D object. As you can see, for the most part, they should be pretty good at this stage. Unless you got some sort of really wacky modeling going on with lots of curves, most things should look decent. There's still some things that are definitely wrong on mine. You can see I've got some stretching here of this square. There is a few seams that maybe are in the wrong place and I might want to change, but for the most part, it's a very good start. So with that out of the way, what we could do next is still continue on the automatic train and try to cut our hard edges. Now, we're going to go over why this is important in just a second, and I'll show you a quick demo of what this looks like. But it also gives us more cuts kind of for free because hard edges do get doubled up and count as 2 vertices in a game engine anyway. And usually spacing in the UV space is going to just help our texture for high poly, but even just for regular sort of texturing and modeling anyway. So as you can see at the moment, I should have hard edges along these sections here and along here, but there's no UV seams, so I don't have any bold white lines. So we can actually get these automatically with our object mode and head to cut and sew just below create. And we've got something called auto seams. I'm going to shift click this and I want to make sure that it's on cut along hard edges. So I'm just going to click that. And that means all that work I did before of creating my hard edges, making sure everything else is a soft edge or an average vertice, should pay off here because it's going to know exactly where the hard edges are. It's going to ignore the flat sections and it's going to just apply some more cuts. So auto seams, and straight away you can see all these orange lines that it's given me. These are the new seams. So as I go into object mode, I can see all these white bold lines. It is now cut. So one of the main reasons we do this is because we want spacing around any sort of hard edge. This is a bit of a complex concept, but I can show you a quick example in Substance Painter, just like we had a look at before. As you can see again, 2 cubes here, exactly the same. Both of them have had a high poly version baked into them. Now on the left here, we've got the hard edges connected. So you can see the UVs, it's just the default UV unwrap of a cube. It's this sort of T shape. If I head to my other texture set, you can see this one's different. Every single edge here I've cut and separated into the 6 faces, and they all have a gap between them. So this is where that important sort of concept comes into play. Where we see the difference, you might even see it already, it's quite subtle, but I'm just going to make sure we can just see 3D, is the corners that are connected give us these weird artifact sort of hard edges, right? You can see it here, this sort of strange hard line, and you can't see it on this one because that one is separated just because of how the thing unfolds. But if we look at our other cube here, this one has all the hard edges separated and they all have a gap in the UVs. We are not seeing any of those strange artifacts. So it is a very important step if you're looking for that high quality, high poly, low poly bake. We want to make sure that every single hard edge is cut and has spacing inside the UV layout. We can also actually visualize why this occurs. If we just have a look at the normal data itself, we can see that on the correct spaced out version, we have no bleeding of the purple color here going into the blue color. So it doesn't look like any of it is facing the wrong way. But on the stuff that is right next to each other, it doesn't have enough space to do its full gradient. And what happens is we get some overlap. So if you look right on top, you can see some purple is creeping in here, and then we've also got some blue creeping in on the purple. So just giving it that space to breathe lets it fully provide its nice gradient here, and that's why we get that nice smooth result without any of the strange artifacting occurring. Getting back to our UV unwrap now, even so we've just created the hard edges here, if I found them in my UV shells, we'll find that they're not separated yet. So we still would have the same issues that I just highlighted in Substance Painter. So we can solve this by doing our layout, and that will spread them out as well. But this really is the stage where you should take a bit of time to do some manual unwrapping and make sure things are how you want them. As mentioned, if this is a faraway object, it's just a prop in the background, you're probably fine with just this and laying it out. But if this is something, your character has to hold, or it's right in the foreground when we walk around, we probably want to spend a bit of time here and just make sure things are as good as we can get them. So chuck on our test texture again, and we should look at where things can be improved. Obviously, in my case, I kind of talked about this area. We can also see that some of this stuff is being stretched out. So there is not going to be a one-trick answer for all of this manual unwrapping. It's really something you have to get your head around and sort of just problem solve and work out where you need to put cuts. Some of this stuff, though, just needs to be unfolded. Because we've added a bunch of new cuts here, these are still the same unfolds that the automatic applied before. So areas like this, where it's probably straighter now, we shouldn't get as much stretching. So in my case, I know for a fact if I grab this whole object here and just go to my unfold, and let's put our test texture on to see the result, and just do an unfold simulation, all of that has sort of stretched out nicely, right? It's not those long rectangles anymore. We've got nice squares here, so that's helped heaps. The only thing I want to say here is don't do this for everything. So you only want to do this for objects that you know aren't going to have distortion, or they've got enough cuts to stop distortion. A good example is this little section here for me. I've got this rounded shape, and one nice thing that regular automatic does is it also straightens some of your shells that should be straightened. So what we mean by this is if we have a look at this section here, it's a nice and straight object, and it's represented here in my UV space. If I was to unfold this, what I get is kind of this weird distorted shape. And that's just because it's trying to flatten it as flat as possible. So it's taking this rounded shape and it's struggling to do so. So it puts this little bend in here. And now we get odd distortion. What we'd probably prefer is this straight distortion. So it's still distorted, it's just distorted in the curve of the shape, which is a lot better in our case. We're going to get a nicer texture there. So we need to be careful about unfolding some things. And this actually goes the opposite way. And where you're going to find things didn't straighten out very well is usually like your curves and cylinders. So automatic does a pretty terrible job a lot of the time on doing an efficient job on things like cylinders or any sort of rounded shape. So I'm not going to do this right now, but I would probably, if I wanted this to look correct, cut this out, this whole sort of section here on the cylinders, and put new manual cuts in myself. So you can see here, some weird zigzaggy seams that the computer has done for me. So this really is the stage you want to jump through, have a look at everything, see if there's any massive distortion still in here. Another one I know in my case, just to kind of show you a manual cut, just to kind of have some difference, is this is not cut here. And that's because this was not a hard seam, and that's intentional on my design. But if we have a look, it's created some wacky distortion here. And the reason for that is when I've done my unfold again, it's still all connected in here, and you can see it looks a little wacky. So this shape here, it's all bent. So what I might want to do is go edge, grab these two edges, just put some seams in there, just with a little shortcut, Shift X, and then unfold them again, and I should get a lot straighter result, right? And that means now, test texture on, everything's looking better. This one here is just rotated funny, which we'll fix in just a second, but the reason for that, it's still kind of fine. So we still got nice squares, and that's what we're looking for at this stage. Awesome. The last step before we lay out our UVs nicely into the tile here is to straighten them as much as possible. We're going to do that with arrange and layout near the bottom. So right at the bottom here. And we're looking for orient shells. This is how I would always start this process, because what this is going to do if I click it is try to straighten everything as much as possible. Now remember, this is a computer doing it, so it may struggle a little bit and it might straighten the wrong direction, but it's always a better start. Now the reason we are going to be orienting shells here is for two reasons. First, of course, if we have nice straight edges, nice square looking shapes, things are going to stack into the tile a lot better. And that means we're going to get more texture space. You can imagine if you're playing Tetris and every block was rotated just at random degrees, you wouldn't be able to stack anything nearly as well as if everything's nice and straight. So we want to make sure things are like that. To fix up some of the ones that didn't work too well with orient shells, what you might have to do is just manually go and find some of the big obvious ones and use something like orient to edges. So a good example, again in mine here, is these little pieces which are on the side of my model here. Now they've kind of rotated in a bit of a strange direction here. They'd probably be better off if they were rotated up like this, just like this on the shell. So what I'm going to do is grab one edge and then go orient to edges. And what that'll do is rotate the shell in line with that edge's angle. So it just works a lot better. I would usually try to keep these angled the same way as well. So I can use J rotate here, just so I can be consistent. Now you'll find things that don't rotate very well is always going to be a lot of long pipes. Really, I would go through and manually unwrap these a little bit better. But what I would probably look for still is the longest edge. I would try to find the longest edge, orient that, and then kind of go through it and fix those up as well, right? So just orienting anything that's really out of whack here. Most of the other stuff here is okay. Now, another reason for this is we want our texture to not look jaggedy, right? We don't want to see the pixels on the texture, most likely. If we have things straight, we're going to get a lot better result. You may have noticed this if you've ever drawn in like Photoshop at low texture resolution, low resolution, you will see when you draw a diagonal line, you kind of get that staircase effect. When we draw straight lines, no matter how sort of minimal on the pixels this is, we are going to get a nice straight line because it's just kind of stacking little squares on top of each other. So let's just jump over to Substance Painter real quick and I'll demonstrate why we want to do this. So I've just set up a bit of an extreme example in Substance to highlight why we want to straighten things out. As you can see here, I've just got a cube, obviously nice straight edges, but in the UV, some of them I've rotated a little bit to the side. So if we just look at this face here, you can see it's represented by this in the UV. And if I draw on this one, it's represented by this rotated one. So when we start working at lower resolutions, as you can see, pretty pixely, right? So when I kind of paint around. Now, this is something that will just happen because your textures are going to be larger objects and you might be working on a small section you're trying to detail it, and you will notice the sort of pixel effect. Now, there's obviously tricks to get around this, which is like blurring it or having a higher resolution texture. But to make our lives easier, we should try to keep things straight so that if we start drawing straight lines or our texture runs a certain way, it's still going to look good at lower resolutions. So if I go to this front facing view and I start drawing kind of this panel line and I hold Shift and Control, I can draw a straight line. Now if I continue this to the side, you can see it gives me a pretty good result nonetheless, right? So even so this is a lower res texture, I'm still getting these nice straight lines here. Now, unfortunately for this one here, the one that's angled, if I go to the side and try to continue this line, holding Control and Shift, it's straight technically with the object, but as you can see, we get this jagged line. So we kind of lose that ability right there to kind of have these nicer looking low res textures if our UV shells are not rotated correctly. So that's the second big reason why we want to make sure things are as straight as possible. All right, let's finish off this UV unwrap for the battery right now. So we've gone through all the good steps. We've had our cuts. We've made sure things are manually unwrapped so that we have less distortion. We've also now straightened them out. So the last thing to do is just lay out the UVs. What we want to lay them out into is this 1x1 UV tile. The reason we don't use the other ones here is they are for other workflows, UV tile workflows or UDIM workflows they're called. They are relevant kind of in the games industry, not as much as something like the film industry. So in this video, I'm not going to cover them. We're just going to focus on this UV tile. So for this object, it only really needs one tile. And we talk about why we need more in just a second when we look at some of our other objects. But for this one, to finish it off, we just want to lay it out. So to get to my layout settings, I'm just going to go to layout right down the bottom. It's in arrange and layout here. shift click on it. And the only thing I usually change in here to get a pretty good result is shell padding and tile padding. What this is the gaps between the shells. And we already talked about why this is important, especially for a high poly, low poly bake. So we want to make sure we do it here. Tile padding is the space actually away from the outside. This is usually a good idea to have some space still, as you don't want any bleeding around this area. And then shell padding is the space between each shell. I usually go for something like 5 and 5. You can do slightly lower, but this just guarantees that all our sort of gradients for the low poly, high poly are going to look great here. So with those changed, just click Layout UVs. What you should get is a really nice packed area. Now, this is kind of a good one to kind of see if things are a little bit strange. So if anything was rotated oddly, you'll really start to notice it. So, I mean, again, in my case, maybe we just want to fix this up a little bit. These little candy cane looking sections, maybe they'd be worth going through and orient to the longest edge like we did. And now I can just grab my UV shells again and just click Layout because my settings would have stayed the same and I just get a slightly better result. We're trying to get as much texture space as possible here because we want to work with the least amount of texture maps that we can while maximizing the amount of texture. This is the idea of texel density. So this one here is great. I could probably put a 2K by 2K texture or a 4K texture on this. If it's something my character's holding, it's probably going to be pretty damn good. I would say it would look pretty nice on the screen. If I have a look at my sort of squares, we can see these squares are representing each one here. So whatever texture pixel by pixel that square is, it represents the space on here and it's all the same. This is what we call texel density. So I want to now have a look at some of my other objects and talk about how we decide on texel density and where to change things, when to use more texture sets, and how to maximize this space without wasting too much time as well. But for now, this battery is technically UV unwrapped. So to understand how to use our texture space as efficiently as possible, we just first need to understand that this 1x1 UV tile just represents one texture map. So whenever we have a texture map in a game, it is also going to have a draw call. So it's going to look for that file and it's going to draw that texture. So we should try to minimize these as much as possible, but we also don't want to skimp on the texture quality. So as I mentioned, this one here is set up for one texture map. So this could be a 2000 by 2000 pixel map, or it could be like a 4K by 4K one. Once you've decided and you've laid it out, the way we actually tag these, you could have it all as one object like I have as well, but the way we tag these as a texture is actually on a material basis. So the last thing to finish off this object is to just hold right click and assign a new material to it. In here, it really doesn't matter what material I use. I'm just going to use our Lambert because it's like a very standard material. And all this is going to do is tag this model with our material. The nice thing about this is you can have multiple materials on the one object. You can do some pretty fancy stuff with it. But for this one, I'm just going to do one material for one object for one UV tile, which equals one texture. What I would do is name this here. Again, this is something that the naming convention, we should kind of keep global if possible. So a lot of the time will just call stuff like battery and then just do MAT for mat as a suffix. But if we want to focus, follow Unreal's naming convention, it is usually done with a M underscore. So it's material and then underscore the name. So this one would be M underscore battery. So now that has been tagged, that's going to show up as a texture set in Substance, which we'll look at shortly. And it will also show up once we get to Unreal as a little material node that we can then edit. So this one has been completed. What we need to now understand is where does this change? Because if we have a look at any other object in the scene, we might not want it to have as much texture as something that the character holds. So if we looked at these tools, sure, they might be tools the character could hold, but if we think about them more as props that might be just sitting against like a farm shed or something, we probably don't want to do something like this, where we give it a whole texture space. Now, just a caveat before I go into this, there is lots of different stuff we can do with this. It's quite a rabbit hole. We can have smaller textures themselves. We can also utilize sort of tile sheets, which means we kind of have a texture on like a flat plane and we're cutting out of there. There's lots of stuff, but for this demo, we're just going to focus on the idea that we're going to apply just straight up texture maps to our objects in the scene, and we want to decide how much texture to give them. So like I was saying, this object here, the shovel, might just be a prop in the distance. It doesn't need that 2000 by 2000 pixels. So what we could probably do is just grab all 4 of these, and as you can see, I've already done it. But if we just grab all 4 objects at once and then do a layout, what we're going to get is them stacked into one. And again, all we need to do here is just assign a new material, lambert it up, and just call this one m_tools. And now I've got this tagged as a material. Even so, these are different objects. I could texture them one by one technically. I would want to do them all together, of course, but they all are connected through a material. Another sort of change would be, bigger objects. So at the moment, if we're looking at this is our sort of base level, what happens when we look at a large object like our house? So the house itself, you could still say is just one object, but if we lay this all out as one texture set, it's going to be pretty damn blurry. And it's only going to have 2K by 2K texture to go over that whole surface area. If you think about it, it's going to look really strange when you've got objects like this, which, might have a couple hundred pixels each on each tool. And then that's spread along the whole surface area here. Things are going to look pretty strange. So what we want to do is break up these objects into more texture sets. And I can visualize this here because I've given them some colors. Every single different color here is its own texture set. So each part represents the same amount of texel density, roughly. I wasn't too accurate with this, and you don't have to be because you're not going to notice it too much. But each part now has its own UV tile layout, and we can kind of see this really quick. If I just jump between each one, they're all different materials. This means we get enough texture to make things look kind of nice. Now, other little things to think about would be how big is it on the screen? So if this was a house that was just in the distance, so I only saw it about this big on the screen, I probably could get away with 2000 by 2000 pixels because we never get close enough to see any of the detail. So it's kind of a waste to have all that detail there. So that can be a big factor when you're trying to choose how much texture to give different things. You just got to think about what is the largest is going to be on my screen. The other thing to think about is try to be smart with this. So if you've got a modular prop, something like this fence where I'm repeating it, if I had this whole length of fence and I turned it into just one texture set, it's going to be pretty poorly done, right? Have a look at something like this here. I've kind of set it up. This is giving me everything separate. Sure, I could give it all unique texture now, but it's going to be pretty low res. So what's actually smarter here is to lay it out as one UV texture set, and then when you duplicate it, what you'll find is they're exactly the same. So we just get that overlapping texture, or the UVs, and that means we get so much more texture space, a lot more quality, and all we need to do to keep this the same is just assign the material first. So if I assign that material of the m_fence, no matter what happens when I duplicate it again, this will still have, if I go to my material attributes, that same material. So whenever I apply it to any object in the scene, it's going to have that material ready for me. One last thing that we should also have a quick look at is sometimes your texel density should be different and not just dependent on how big it's on the screen or how sort of important it is. Some things just need more texture. So if we think about the rocks here, they don't really need that much texel density because they're pretty plain. So they've just got, a pretty blocky sort of color to them. Something like the house, the walls, it needs a little bit to capture like the little brick details, but probably not as much as something like a poster. So if we just think about that, that's also going to help drive. If it's something the character needs to come and have a look at and read, this is going to fall apart so much quicker when we lower the resolution than something like the house or the rocks, because they're sort of a fairly general color, and that means it's going to hold up way better than if we need detail. Same with things like on the side here, I've got some text on the battery. This would disappear as soon as I lose texel density. So we really got to be careful and at least match the detail that we need to show that the character or the player can see when they're looking at these textures. With our model fully prepared now, the only thing to do is export it. and then we can texture it in Substance Painter, and this will also be the export that goes straight into Unreal as well. So before we click export, something we should pretty much always do is triangulate the model. Now, the annoying thing about triangulation is if you do need to make changes to your model, it can be hard to edit it afterwards. So what I recommend when I'm doing my exports is just do a save, Control S, or make an increment if you want to, and then apply the triangulation, and what you can do is revert back. If you want to be super safe, you could even do a Control S, then do another file save scene as like our export file. But I find this is pretty good as well. So with the object you want to export, you just want to head up to Mesh, and we're looking for Triangulate. Now, the reason we want to triangulate is because the game engine will triangulate your mesh anyway. If we do this at this stage, it's going to lock in how it looks in Maya. So you can see it's gone through and it's split up all my quads into triangles. If you let the Unreal Engine do this, or any other game engine, what can happen is sometimes these will triangulate the opposite way. So instead of this line going across here, it might come straight down here. And it's okay if it's a flat surface, but if you have any sort of bent edges, what can happen is they can bend the other way and things might start really meshing together, and you might lose sort of volume that you didn't even realize you had. This is especially relevant on very low poly models. So it's a really good idea to just lock this stuff in. It just means the engine doesn't have to do anything once it's there because it's already triangulated. So with this triangulated object ready to go, all we need to do is export it. I am going to head up to File, and I'm actually going to use this game exporter. You can use export selection, but this one's kind of nice to use once you get used to it. First thing we want to change is at the top, export all, change to export selection. With that, these settings at the top you can kind of leave. As you see, there's a triangulate here. This has been bugged for a long time where you can't do it with smoothing groups. For the most part, without smoothing groups, it'll be fine, but it avoids giving us little weird errors popping up when we import stuff. So all these settings we can kind of leave, and that's what's nice about the game exporter. It's kind of set up for this already. The only other thing you may want to change here is the move to origin. So it's in settings. This might be closed by default. Move to origin will just give us either where it is in the world space of our scene. So if you're setting up your Maya scene to be the game environment, I wouldn't click this, because what we can do is then revert the origin, well, where the object should be in Unreal, and it will just get put into place. Where I would tick this is if this is an object you're going to scatter around differently, because if we have this offset like this and we don't tick this, what's going to happen is the pivot point, once we get to Unreal, is going to look something like this. And it can be kind of annoying because we've got to move it around offset from the origin point. But if this was exactly the spot we wanted it and we didn't want to move it at all, that's probably fine to do. So you're going to have to make that decision yourself. In my case, I'm going to leave it unticked just because I don't really need to. And I'm pretty close to the origin. Last thing to change here at the bottom is the path. So this is where you really want to set up a folder somewhere. I've just got another folder here randomly, but what you would want to be doing is make an assets folder, and then this would be your models. So I would call this one my models file. Inside there, that is my path. Underneath that, you've got the name. So this could be my battery low. The name itself here is actually just the FBX file. So it's not going to be remembered once you put this into Unreal. So all that naming convention stuff doesn't really matter as much because the underlying model name is still the one that we're going to see once we put it into Unreal. If you want to, again, there's nothing wrong with it. We could call it our static mesh battery. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with that as well. Or just call it geometry. Just make sure you hit enter here. You can see it still says the old name I had there, tools. If I don't hit enter, that will override the tools on when I click export. It's a bit of an annoying thing, but just make sure enter, set that in. Now it's going to the right place. Click export here. Awesome. The only other thing that's going to be different is it's export selection. So we can do multiple objects. You could even do all of your objects in your scene all at once. It will be a little annoying to texture. Your computer might run slow, but the nice thing is you'll be able to see other objects and then texture them in relativity. So something like this large object, my house here, I would definitely export that as one thing because it's going to come into Substance. I'm going to be able to separate it with the texture set, so all these different colors here, and it should be fine. And once we put it into Unreal, it's also going to be perfect. So same thing here. I would just want to go make sure everything's correct. It should save all your settings, just going to the right path. And then again, change this to SM_house instead. And then make sure I hit enter and then export. Now they've gone out. So that is everything. I'll go over a little bit of a run through of what we just did, and then we'll head on to Zbrush getting organic models. To summarize, preparing and exporting hard surface modeled props out of our modeling software, we want to make sure we have completed the following steps. Modeled to scale, checked the model integrity and fix any modeling errors, name objects appropriately, harden and soften edge normals, UV unwrap, ensuring minimal distortion, cuts on hard edges, straight UVs where possible, UVs then laid out with appropriate texel density, apply a material for each texture set. Afterwards, we want to triangulate the model and then finally export it as an FBX file. Let's now go over the same preparation, but for organic models and props sculpted in Zbrush. Jumping into Zbrush here, we can see I've got a sculpted prop. So I've just got this little rock here. Now this rock is just sculpted to the highest degree that I want it to be. You can see I've got active points. It's over 500,000. So it's not really good for a game. So what we need to do is prepare this a little bit. The first thing, of course, we should check here is just, we've not got too many obvious errors or anything. Same sort of thing as before. We do want to make these to scale. Getting the scale set up in Zbrush is a little bit annoying. Most of the time when I'm creating stuff in Zbrush, I'm using a base mesh that I create in something like Maya. So as long as your base mesh is to scale, it's going to work. But again, worst case scenario, we can always just scale this up later on as well. So what we need to do here is actually make a copy of this. So this can still be our high poly. We're still going to use this detail, but we're going to bake it into a low poly. Pretty much always for organic shapes and objects, we want to have a high and low poly because there's a lot of detail we're going to sculpt into them. But for the low poly version, we can actually be pretty efficient by decimating it pretty low because it's not something that most of the time needs to animate very well. So we can kind of have a lot of triangles and just bake them into the mesh. To do that, we're just going to head over to our subtool. You can see at the moment, I just call Rock 4. We're definitely going to change that name. And we're going to duplicate it. So open the subtool menu here, head down and click duplicate. I'm now going to rename these. So one at a time. It doesn't really matter at this point which one is which, but we want one to be our high and one to be our low poly. So just click rename. I'll go rock_low for the top one. And then this one rename rock_high. Now the high one can just sit there. That's all you need to do. If you have like over 1 million polys for the high, I would actually recommend you decimate it as well down to about 1 million. You probably won't lose too much detail and it will just help the bake process go a little bit smoother. So with this now, that one's complete. Let's head back to the rock low and let's do a decimation on it. To do that, we're going to go up to Z plugin here, Decimation Master, and we just want to pre-process this. So at the moment, it's on 20%. So if we think about what 20% of 500,000 might be, it should be about 100,000. So that still might be a bit much. So we might want to pull this down to something quite a bit lower. I might do under 5-ish, right? So even something like this, don't be too accurate. I can always kind of change it. You can see the poly count here might be better to look at. So I might even take that lower because this is going to be a rock. I really don't want too many polys on this. Maybe even 3,000. That might be pretty good. So really, really low percentage. You really want to just kind of give it a shot. And then if it's not enough of the silhouette, we want to go back and up this. So pre-process current, you'll see this happen up the top left. Once it's done, you just go back in there again and just go decimate current. And it has gone down to that 3,000 number. I'm just going to turn off my high poly to see what's happened. And you can see pretty good result. So again, really dependent on the game, what you define as low poly, what you need for your game. 3,000, it's not tiny, but it's also not massive either. So if it was a fairly common rock or a fairly large rock, this will probably be pretty damn good. We could always try decimate it further and go further, completely up to you. So for now, I'm just going to leave mine. And as you can see, the most important thing here is our silhouette doesn't change. If you notice when you turn the high poly on, there's a big sort of cut out missing from your low poly. That's when you want to go probably a little bit higher. But for now, this is probably fine for me. I reckon I definitely could go lower. What we need to do now is UV unwrap the low poly so that it can take texture, because at the moment it will not take texture at all. So with our low poly selected, we want to head up to Z plugin again. Down the bottom, you'll find UV master. There's a few things in here we can look at, but most of the time just hitting unwrap will do the job. Unwrap all is here. It says all visible tools or subtools. This is great if you have multiple objects you want to do at the same time. Just make sure you click the little eye for each one. And the other thing we might want to turn off is symmetry. At the moment, symmetry is on, and because we are okay with any sort of distortion, it might be worth turning that off as well. What we can do now is click unwrap, and we should see it happen up in the top left. One island generated. So by default, it's only going to make one island. It puts one cut through the whole object, and that's why you will get a bit of distortion, but it is okay distortion because it's a pretty organic shape and it should wrap fairly well around here anyway, unless you're looking to like really detail or put like cave paintings or something on these rocks. It won't be the end of the world. All we need to do now is export our models. So we have the two models, so we are going to do two exports here. Let's start with the low poly. We're going to do this using the FBX export import here in the Z plugin section. The reason for this is it's going to, one, be able to smooth the normals, which will make a lot of sense. And if you have multiple subtools, you can also use this all or visible. I'm just going to use selected just because that's all I need. And besides that, everything else should be pretty damn good. I'm just going to click export. It should give you a little option to send them to the right place. So let's just choose a good location and save that one. Now I'm going to just repeat that exact same step with the high poly. So just going to go here, selected, export. Just make sure you name them correctly. Again, the naming convention is we're going to refer more to this one in here. So making sure we have underscore low and high is kind of key. And then just go save out here. Be aware this one will take a little bit longer because it is the high poly. But now we should have exported both objects. To summarize the preparation and export of sculpted organic props, these steps should be followed. The first step is to sculpt your prop to scale, sculpting at the highest degree of detail you need for your object. Next, we should duplicate this object and suffix one of them underscore low and one of them underscore high. For the object tagged as our low poly, we must reduce the poly count. We can do this in Zbrush using the Decimating master. We want to take this down to something that is way more appropriate for a game engine. If your high poly model has over 1 million polys, you also may want to decimate it, as too high poly counts can slow down the baking process. The low poly model must now be UV unwrapped. We can do this automatically using something like the UV master in Zbrush, or it could be taken out and done manually in another program. Finally, we must do two separate FBX exports with the low poly as one and the high poly as one object. Now we've covered our preparation for organic props as well as our hard surface model props. We can now jump into Substance Painter and have a look at the processes we need to do for import, setup, and exporting textures. The process in Substance Painter is exactly the same between all your models. So even if it's the organic or the hard surface models, this few steps to get started and all the way to the export will be exactly the same. So to get started, we're just going to go File, New. All we need to do is change this template at the top. And because we're going to be heading to Unreal Engine, we're just going to look for Unreal Engine. This, of course, is the same. If you want to go to Unity, you can even see Unity's just above there as well. But Unreal Engine is what we're going to do. Click that, and it should actually change all the settings to be perfect for you. So it ups the document resolution for you, DirectX is correct, and this compute tangent space is also correct here. For the file, we just want to find this to the right, hit select, and what I'm looking for is my low poly version. So I don't need to select any high polys at this point. So let's just do my battery. So I'm going to go battery low here, and I'm just going to go OK. This should bring it into my scene, and now I can see it's almost ready to texture. Before I texture, what I want to do is bake in the high poly. Now, even if you don't have a high poly here and you just have a regular model that you're just going to use, there's nothing wrong with that. Just be aware you should still bake it into itself. This will give you more options for your texturing. It will let you use all the tools that Substance has to offer. To get to our baking menu in the latest version, we just want to hit this little croissant at the top, or we can hit F8. Screen should look something like this. We should see our model here on the right, and then we've got a whole bunch of baking settings on the left. Top left, we've got texture set list. We can see that we've just got one texture set because that is correct for this object. I'll show you some quick examples near the end of this section of what it might look like if it's a little bit different. Only things we really need to worry about is changing our output size here, and we'll add our high definition mesh. Like I said, I don't want to go too crazy into all the in-depth stuff that goes into baking a high poly to a low poly, but I'll show you how to do a quick result here and get a pretty good one at that. So high definition meshes, we just want to select this little thing on the right and look for our high poly. With that, we also want to just change our output size. Now, actually the higher we go here, the better. So even if you go to 8K, what it'll do is then it will just downscale, and this will usually look a lot nicer. So for now, I'm just going to do 4,000 and it'll still look pretty good. But if I was doing this finalized, I'd probably up it as well. The other thing you may want to change to get a better result is anti-aliasing. This will really help on a normal map. So again, put this as high as you possibly can, and just be aware, again, higher just means longer process. So be patient with it, and depending on the quality you need out of this as well. The last thing to check before we hit bake is this max frontal distance and rear distance. When we're baking, we're actually baking around what we call our cage. And in the latest version of Substance, we can actually see it here. So this sort of yellowy sort of mesh on top of our model is our cage. The cage defines how far the low poly model should look for the high poly model. So the high poly model is in this at the moment. And if we start to bring down this frontal distance, we're going to hit a point where we're going to start to see it bleeding through. And we can see it here, right? So in this section of my model, I really should have had more detail there to capture this. So I kind of am limited by this section. Pretty much what you're looking for is you don't want any red. So the trick here is to find the smallest number you can have without any red, right? So you want to make sure you capture the high detail. But if you have this too high, what's going to happen is everything is going to bleed into each other. So you want to kind of find this nice sweet spot where you've got the lowest value and you're going to get the best amount of detail without bleeding into other sections. So in my case, about there. When you're happy with all that, just click Bake Selected Textures. After a little bit, the baking process should be completed. And what you can do now is return to painting mode. Your model should look just nicer by default. It's got all that texture, all the mesh maps baked in there now, which can be referenced with our smart materials. And it just makes, one, the texturing process a lot easier, as well as it's baked in our high poly. So you can see I'm getting those fake sort of little edge highlights that make a realistic model, and things are just looking better overall. Now, once you've gone ahead and done the hard work of texturing up your object, the only thing left to do is export the textures. So to do this correctly for our Unreal export, we want to just head up to File, Export Textures, or Control-Shift-E, open up our export settings here, and the only thing we need to look for, which it should have changed for us because of our initial selection of our template, is this output template. Unreal Engine 4 Packed is what we're looking for. What this will do is pack the metallic and roughness channels together, which is very nice for the game, just makes everything run a little bit smoother. The size here is the only other thing I would have a look at. You can bump this higher than what you've textured at. So technically I textured here at 2048, but I bumped it up to 4096, so I can get more texture out of this one texture set. So this is again where you need to decide on the texel density you need for the game, what's going to run the best, and it's very much a case-by-case sort of section. Last thing to check is your output directory here. So you just want to find your asset folder, and this time you might want to start making a textures folder together. Save your textures in there. The alternative is to actually keep your model and texture for each thing in its own folder. That's something I personally like to do, but it really depends on where you're working. If it's for yourself, if you're for a studio, everyone is going to have a different sort of setup that you need to follow, as long as you're staying organized in some way. Once you're happy with everything here, all you need to do is click export. This should bump out at least 3 maps. In my case, I did have a missive on my texture as well. Sometimes you may not have that if you haven't painted it into your model at all. That covers everything we need to know about the Substance Painter section. I just want to quickly showcase that it is the exact same thing if we did our organic sculpted. So if I just grab my rock low here, and you should see that I've got my model. When I go to my baking section, choose my high poly rock, up the output size, and just go bake selected textures, we can see it does bring forth that high poly. Even so, we've exported it different way, different program, still the exact same concept here getting applied. And when we export these textures, same thing will happen. Only other difference you'll come across is if you've got a project where you've got multiple texture sets in the same file. So you can see here, here's that house from before, and each piece here is a different material. So that means different texture set. And that also means every single one has its own bake. So every one of these has a different set of bake mesh maps. So that means it will take a little bit longer, but again, you're getting more texture detail. Also, when you go to export these textures, you'll see that it's got the whole list of every single texture set here. So that means you're going to get 3 times the amount of texture sets. So it'll just be a lot more textures. You just got to make sure you keep them organized and in the same place. In summary, the steps to take in Substance Painter with your models is as follows. Create a new project using the Unreal Engine 4 packed template and choose your FBX file that contains your low poly unwrapped models. Enter baking mode and check out the following settings. You want your output size to be as high as possible. Anything over 4K is pretty good. In the high definition meshes, select any high poly models you're going to use. If you don't have a high poly model for this prop, don't worry, it's still a good idea to bake the mesh maps as you'll still get a lot of data out of them. Ensure the max frontal distance is the smallest distance it can be without losing any of your high poly detail. Use the 3D mode on the right to look for any red sections and try to get it as close as possible before seeing red. Add some anti-aliasing, the higher the better again. This will just mean your maps are a little higher quality. Once that's all set up, hit Bake Selected Textures and it will bake all the mesh maps you need for your model. With the mesh maps baked, you'll now need to texture your object up to the quality that you want it to be. And then finally, export the textures. Make sure the export template is on Unreal Engine. Choose an appropriate location and ensure the size is correct with what you're working with. We're now going to take everything we've just done and import it into Unreal. So at this point, we should have our low poly props as FBX files. These are the ones that are unwrapped and we textured in Substance Painter. Alongside that, we should have our exported textures. There will be a base color, a normal map, this packed map, which is occlusion, roughness, and metallic all together. And then optionally, you may have a missive if you painted that in. Just a side note here, if you have glass or transparency, you will have to do a slightly different method, which I'll point out as we go. But for the main sort of showcase here, we're going to be focusing on opaque props. So that will not include any transparency. To start with the manual process, we should still do a bit of setup to make things easy for ourselves. In the description of this video, you should find a download to a zip folder containing these .us set files. This includes the automatic widget that we'll cover a bit later, but it's also got some default maps that we can use to set up a master material. There's also a master material in here already that you can use, but I think it's a good thing to know how to set up in case you want to change it up, especially if you want to do things like add a glass master material instead of just an opaque one. So your asset files are a little bit funny in Unreal. You can't just drag them in to import. What we need to do is find the content folder of our project here. If I just control space to open up my content browser, I just want to right click on content in the left here and click show in Explorer. This will bring up where all our content is, and we just have to take these UAsset files here, grab them all, drag them in. We should see them appear down in our little browser here, and they're ready to use. So what we're going to set up is a version of this. If I double click on the master material, we can see what we kind of need to set up. I'm going to set up an even more basic one just to get the idea in your head, and then you can kind of customize it further. You can have a look at this one and see how it looks as well, and then decide on what you would like to use for your projects. The main things to note inside this master material is parameters for every single texture map that we'll have. So if you remember, we looked at our texture maps exported, and there was the 4. So we had our base color, emissive, normal, and then the ORM, the occlusion, roughness, metallic map. So in this master material, you can see I have a base color parameter, an ORM, an emissive, and a normal here. I've got some extra stuff that controls the height of the normal, as well as sort of emissive intensity multiplier, and then some overrides for the colors and the roughness and metallic as well. But let's have a look at setting one of these up, as it will help our process quite a lot, and getting that under your skill set will also help you in the future. I'm just going to close this one, head back to my content browser, and let's just make a new version of this. So I'm going to right click and create a new material. Call this something that makes sense. Maybe I'll call it something like opaque master. And if we want to follow the correct naming conventions, we should put an M underscore in front of it as well, as that's how Unreal usually does it for their materials. Once we've got this material, we want to double click on it so we can get to this editing stage. Now, one thing we need is some kind of maps to use as our default values. So that's why I've included these 4 here. These are just literal 1 by 1 pixel maps, which just means they're quite efficient. They're not massive, they're incredibly tiny, and they'll just help us have default textures for our master material. There's one thing we do need to make sure before we import these, and that's the ORM map here. We want to double click on it. I've already turned it off on this one, but by default, every texture you import will have sRGB ticked. If we don't untick this, it will kind of read it weirdly because it's expecting it to be a linear color file and not a sRGB file. So we want to make sure we just untick that for any occlusion, roughness, metallic maps that we import in here. We can now just close this one, head back to our master opaque material, and let's start importing these files in. So I'm just going to drag them in. You can see here I've got my material output, and I'm just going to put my base color up the top. Underneath that, I'm going to put my ORM map. Underneath that, I'm going to put my emissive, and then underneath the normal map. So just be aware that these will look very similar. If you're unsure which one is which, you can just look in the details panel down the left. You can see default ORM, default emissive here. Now what we need to do with all these files is actually convert them to parameters, because what we want to end up doing with this master material is when we import new objects, we want to create instances of the master material that can be easily swapped out. So the instances will hold parameters that we can access. We won't be able to see this graph, but we'll be able to change out the maps, and then it'll be a lot easier to assign textures for our objects. The easiest way to make these into parameters is just to right click on them, convert to parameter. We want to give these a name. If you would like to use this master material that you create for the auto text, it might be a good idea to copy my names exactly, but we can actually change them in the little widget, which I'll show you later as well. We'll call this one base color. I'll do the American spelling for Americans. And we're also going to change this one. So convert to parameter. This one is going to be ORM for occlusion, roughness, metallic. This one is going to be emissive. And then we've finally got normal here. So convert to parameter and normal. The last thing to do is connect these up to the material output. With this, all we need to know is which of these little outputs to connect to the material outputs. So we're going to take base colors RGB into the base color. The ORM map is the most interesting one. So If we had a look at a file when we import it, we'll see why this is the case, but we just have to follow the name, right? So ORM, occlusion is first, roughness, then metallic. So that actually follows to the red channel, the green channel, then the blue channel. So occlusion goes to ambient occlusion. The green R goes to roughness, and then the blue goes to metallic. Emissive, it's an RGB. We're going to take that one to emissive color. And then finally, our normal map, we take to normal. This is actually all the setup we need. If we have a look over to the left in our parameters, we can see now we've got these slots for our textures. So whenever we create an instance of this master material, we will now have access to each of these maps here. So I'm just going to do an apply and a save. And this one will be ready to take some textures. Let's now have a look at importing our assets into our Unreal scene. So we should have our model file and then all the textures alongside it. We want to stay organized with this. So there's a few ways to import. We can just click import in the content browser here. You can right click, go import. A lot of the time I just prefer to drag and drop stuff in. So we could grab these, but we also want to stay organized. So we want to make a folder. If you already got a folder in your Windows Explorer, we can actually just use that. So I can just drag the whole folder in here. And as soon as I let go, a little settings box pops up. This settings box is actually only referring to the model itself. So the FBX import, as you can see here, the textures will come in automatically. The only setting we really need to change here, everything else should be pretty damn good by default, is this material section. And this is again, just to speed things up for us. Even so, this first process, we're doing the manual method. We want to just look for material import method, create new materials, and we want to change this to create new instance materials. It's going to ask us to choose our material, our base material. So we want to open up this and just look for the one we've just created. So we just made that opaque master. So I'm going to click that, and now I'm going to just ignore all this. This does work if you've got materials set up in another program. So unfortunately, that would require a manual process anyway, or using another automatic tool. So for now, we're going to ignore this, and I'll show you how I approach this as well later. Everything is fine as long as our master material is chosen. Select import all, or import, really doesn't matter. And what you should see is all our assets have come in. Down the bottom, it'll say our normal map was imported as a normal map, which is good. We usually want that to happen. And we've also got our static mesh, which is our object itself. And then alongside that, we've got our material. So you'll notice that this is actually, if you hover over it, a material instance. So it's a material instance of the parent, the master, opaque master that we created before. So I could just drag this battery into my scene just to kind of have it real time so we can kind of see it. And we can see it's got that red texture already on because that's the default that we used. If I double click on my material instance here, what we'll see is a material, but it's a little bit different. We don't have that graph in the middle with all the spaghetti. We've just got the orb itself here, and then all we have access to is any parameters we made. So I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller so we can kind of see it happen in real time as well. Now, before we actually change our parameters here, something we really need to do is change the occlusion roughness metallic map to that linear color type of texture. So to do that, we just need to double click on it before we put it in. Have a look on the right here, and you're looking for this little tick box like we saw before. We want to untick that. This will now act appropriately for when we put it into parameters. So heading back to the material instance, the way we overwrite these is we just tick the box, and as you can see, that ungrays out this area here, and we can now change them. A few ways to change them. You can just click on here and find them. So if I go base color, we can change it. The other way is you can drag it from your content browser down the bottom here. So sometimes that's what I prefer if you've got it set up nicely. And then the ORM map goes in here. As you can see, this actually happens real time. So material instances are kind of funky in the sense that they just work straight away. So now when I just save this out, it should be completely fine. I can close it, and everything is set up correctly. So everything here should look exactly how it looked inside of Substance Painter. Nothing should look kind of wrong. All the metal should show up correctly. All the roughness values and everything else here should look pretty damn good. Now, while this is all well and good for a single prop, when you're making a game or whatever project you're working on, you're going to have a lot of textures, a lot of materials, and you can imagine this process gets quite tedious. So let's have a look at it with this little demonstration here of the house model. So the house model in my case has a whole bunch of textures and materials that I definitely don't want to sit through and drag and drop into each one. It's going to take me a long time. So what I've got here for you to use, and this is not something that's super efficiently done or anything, it's just a bit of an automation. You can definitely find other versions of this where people have it so it automates on the import itself. The way this one works, and we'll kind of bring it up in a second, is it actually just searches for the textures inside your project and then assigns them, tries to match them up to a material that exists already. So let's have a go with this one. First thing I need to do is the same thing I did before, import this whole folder. And I'm just going to drag this in. Now, one thing with this one is it's made of multiple objects. So I might want to combine the meshes here. If I tick this, it's going to come in with just one model itself. If I don't tick it, each part of the house can come apart. So I prefer probably here just to do a combine meshes. And that means I'll just have one model to work with because I don't intend to animate different parts of the house or anything like that. Again, we just want to make sure material import method here is create new instance materials. I'm actually going to use the regular master material, the one I provided in the download, just for here as well. I'm just going to click import, and in a second I should see it all come in. As you can see here, it's converting all the normal maps. It's created a whole bunch of stuff for me. Everything here is all my material instances of my master material. So you can see quite a lot. So this could get pretty damn tedious if I went in here and had to grab all this stuff. As you can see here, the static mesh is just this one model, right? So if I put that into the scene, you can see it just comes in all together. One thing to note, because this may have been, and it was in my project that I worked on, in the correct place in Maya or wherever I created it, you'll notice here it actually puts this location kind of strange. So if I just reset this value, this is where it was sitting in the Maya file. So something to be aware of, if your props are not something that you're distributing in the engine, you can always revert them to their original position using that. The only time that'll change is if on your export, if you remember from Maya, we had that move to origin option in the FBX exporter. So that will just always put it to the middle of the world here. Just for showcase purposes, I might just quickly jump over and do a new folder here and just call it test. And I want to show you what this looks like if we were to not combine the meshes. So I might just chuck just the model in here just to showcase this. I get my little settings pop up and I'm going to untick our combine meshes this time. And we'll just see what the difference is, just so you're aware. So if I just go import all, you can see this time it's split up every single piece into a separate object, right? So all the different objects that were different in the scene now come in differently. So if I imported just like one at a time, it would kind of be weirdly blocked out. But be aware, if I grab them all and put them all together, they still will kind of come in as a nice object. So we don't really have to worry too much about this. Depends on what you need to do with your scene. So now we've got our model in here and all the textures inside. This is where I want to introduce the little widget that I've created. So the way this works is to open it up, you actually have to right click on it and go run editor utility widget. Once you've done that once, you will actually find it all the time in tools, editor utility widgets, and it will just be here. It doesn't pop up here until you've run it once though. It's kind of an interesting one, but you can also always access it by just right clicking running. If you want to see how it works, you can always double click on it here. It'll pop up and then you can go to the graph and you can see the blueprints behind it. I don't believe it's the most efficient way of doing this, but I'm pretty new to blueprints, so it's just something I've cobbled together. But it does the job and it still makes things a lot easier. Now, what we need to look and understand about this is just a few things. So this is set up to work with this master material that I've provided in the download, this m_master. And by default, that is the one that's chosen. If we wanted to, we can actually switch it over to that other material that we created before, and it would still work pretty damn well. The only time that it would fail is if your parameters are different names inside that master material. So if they are, you can still make it work. You just need to change the name here so it knows what to search for. This little skip button, this just means that if it has gone through and it's run once, it will tag a little parameter inside this master material. If we have a look down here, this one here, textures assigned, and it'll just tag it so that it doesn't include it in the search for next time. So it can just help it run a little bit faster. Last thing is it's looking for these suffixes on the textures. So I've set this up so that it works exactly with Substance Painter's Unreal Engine 4 packed export. So you shouldn't need to change anything here if you've used that in Substance Painter. And what it's looking for is it's going to just append 2 underscores to the material name. So if we looked at the house here, it's going to look for these names here, bridge roof underscore matte, and then it's going to look through the textures. And it's going to look for that with 2 underscores on each side, because how the default export happens in Substance Painter is it puts the model name, then it has the material name under with 2 underscores on each side of it, and then it has the material map name. So it's got occlusion, roughness, metallic, or normal at the end. So all we actually need to do for this one is click this giant blue box that says click for auto texture assignment. It can take a few seconds sometimes, but if I just click it, what we should see is all our textures just get assigned for us. What is also lovely about this is it has gone through and it changed every single one of these textures that needed to be changed from sRGB on to sRGB off. So everything that should be a linear color actually gets automatically changed as well. You can see all my material instances now have been tagged, overwrit, and they've just kind of slotted in those nice textures for us. So as you can see, pretty nice. Saves you a hell of a lot of time. Even if it does take, took about 10 seconds there. If you took a minute, it would still be a lot of time saved. So definitely worth checking out, including some sort of automation into your workflow, because it is just going to speed up, especially this tedious sort of section. To summarize our Unreal imports, starting with the manual process, we want to make sure we create a master material containing parameters for each texture map, or you can use the one provided down below. We want to import our FBX model files as well as our textures. On the FBX import settings, we want to make sure we change our material import method to create new instance materials and select your master material in this section. We want to make sure that our ORM, occlusion roughness metallic map, is set to linear color by unchecking sRGB in its details. We can find it by double clicking on it. We then want to double click on our new material instance that it will create and override the texture parameters with our imported textures. Now let's just do a quick summary of how to use the automatic texture to material widget that I've provided. First, need to download the zip folder below, extract it. Inside there will be UAsset files that you need to copy into your Unreal Engine project's content directory. You've got to make sure you do this in your Windows Explorer, as you can't do it in Engine. Import your models and textures, ensuring the same thing as before, that your material import method on the FBX is create new instance materials. You want to select your master material here. If you're using the one provided, it is m_master. You can then run the auto text to matte widget by right-clicking on it and selecting Run Editor Utility Widget. Ensure the settings match if you're using different names or assets. They should be all right if you're using everything provided. Then at the bottom, click the big button that says Click for Auto Texture Assignment. As long as all your naming conventions are correct, everything should work and all your textures should be assigned automatically. To finish off the video, let's have a general look at the whole pipeline. We modeled or sculpted props to scale and checked for any modeling errors. UV unwrapped the low poly models, laying out the UVs with appropriate texel density for their use in the project or game. Defined texture sets by applying materials to those texture sets. Adhered to consistent naming conventions across materials and models. Exported models as FBX files, separating high poly and low poly models. Import unwrapped models into Substance Painter using the Unreal Engine template. Baked our mesh maps utilizing high poly models if we had them and if needed for the object. Textured up the props to our liking. Export the texture maps using the Unreal template again. Set up Unreal by creating a master material or downloading the one provided. Import models and textures into our project, and then assign the textures using our manual method or automatically using the widget that I've provided in the download. That concludes pretty much everything. Hopefully the information provided here helps you set up your own nice and clean pipeline for creating your props and assets for your game projects.